Alright, it's NG Phoenix here, and I'm going to explain basic block rendering. I have two basic classes, just a regular mod and a block. First, we're going to start out from the very basic of the modding. We create a new class called mod underscore. It has to start with mod underscore so it can be loaded in. Mod underscore test mod, and we're gonna have to add an extends base mod since it is basically a mod, of course. It'll ask you to create a default template. If you're using Eclipse, it will. I'm just doing this in Notepad. It'll ask you to create a template of this version function right here. This is where you for my mod, I write beta 1.7.3, the version, and then the version of the mod. Since this is a new mod, we'll just start at 1. So the first thing we do is we have some definitions, the block, the ID that we're going to use, the texture, which it goes to the brick block and gets its texture, and the render ID, which will later be set. And then in the initializer function, you'll have to write that yourself. You start with you assign a new block test to the block right here using the ID and the texture ID. You do set hardness, resistance, step sound. You set the block name right here. It has to be a custom name, or else it'll just, if you set it to like Obsidian, it'll just look at Obsidian's text rather than what you assign to it. And then you register the block right here. I'm not exactly sure what this does, but if you're not creating an item of your block, you need to do this. You do an add name right here using the block object and the name you want. Like if you assigned Obsidian right here and you put in test block right here, it would just go to Obsidian instead of test block. And then we're going to assign a unique block model ID, as it's called, to this render ID, which we'll use later. Now we're going to start off with the basic test block. We have our initializer right here. Here's the block ID. Here's the texture ID. This is an already built-in material you can do. I'm not sure what other materials there are. I just use the autocomplete window. Tick on load. Unless you're doing anything like really, grass and stuff, tick on load and stuff when you spawn it. You don't really need that. Quantity dropped 1, you can change that like clay as 4. And then you can do ID drop for rather dropping clay blocks. You drop clay items. If you want to set a custom item, I just set it to this block ID. The render type, this is really important towards the custom rendering function. You have to send it to the test render ID that you assigned right here, this get unique block model ID. It has to be set to that or it won't work. There's also this function override right here called render as normal block. This has to be set to false. You have to override this to return false, or else it will not render like you want in the function. Opaque cube, it just saves you some time from fixing up sides that just don't appear. If you have like a post sticking out of the ground rather than a full block, the entire floor under it will just be invisible and you can see like all the caves and just the blue void. So it's important to override this to false. Now that we have our test class set up, we're going to set up a rendering function. The way the rendering function works is if it's the I'll just go to the render blocks function and show you. The original class is render blocks. What it does is, these are all the built-in numbers, so if it's this number, it returns this function. This function returns a boolean, which should be true if it renders correctly. And then it goes to all these other statements over here. And then the final statement, it does an else, and it calls the mod loader to go to all the mods that register this hook right here. So it works like a similar setup right here. If it's equal to this render ID, it returns this function. Now it calls it using the block, which is this class right here, IJK for XYZ. Render blocks, a class that we just looked at. This is important for actually making the stuff appear. iBlock access, this is how you get the block that's above, below, or to the left, and whatever, wherever you want. So we have our public boolean render test block function right here. All our stuff set up. The way it works is you have to set the block's bounds. You will set block test bounds to 0, 0, 0 to 1.51, which will be basically a half block. And you have to call this function from render blocks called render standard block. This will actually draw the block. It'll be a half block because it looks towards the block bounds for the minimum x and the maximum x and the y and the whatever. So if you want, like, I don't know, a very thin piece on the bottom and a very thin piece on the top, if you wanted, you'd have to call this, you'd have to set it to like very thin bottom, it goes from 0 to 0.1, very thin top, it goes from 0.9 to 1, and after each of them you have to call this function to actually draw that piece of it. And at the very end, it's very important to set it to the original block bounds, or else it'll just act strange. It's like on my very first test for the fireplace, I forgot to put this function in, so like one wall of the fireplace, which is one separate block that got rendered by these two bits right here, was where you actually had to punch if you wanted to break it. So I fixed it by adding this. If you set custom block bounds in here already, such as you have this already going to half the block size, right here you'll have to set it to the same exact one that you put in this block test class, or else it'll act strange again. And you have to return true. This was a bug in my mod at 1 version where if you put the blocks so high or high enough that they would just disappear. This is because I didn't return true. I don't know why I didn't, but whatever, that's off topic. So you have to return true to get that to work, and that's basically how it renders. There also are other things you can do. Like, for example, I render the wood blocks in my fireplace, so you can't use the same texture to do all sorts of things, as it would just appear funny. There'd be like random spots on it. So you have to set the override texture. The way this works is render blocks override texture. I forgot whether that was capital. I'll just look it up quickly. Here it is. You set this override texture to, so we started out with this brick block index and texture. How about we set it to obsidian dot block index in texture. So now it's set to render that, but unless you want entire chunks looking like obsidian, you have to add this afterwards. You have to set it to -1, because if the render blocks acts kind of strange. If you have it set to -1, it'll realize that it has to reset the override texture or just not use the override texture. So it'll do what it has to do. So now we have our override texture. Let's go ahead and put it in the middle. And so this will currently look like one flat brick plate on the bottom, one flat brick plate on the top, and in the middle, one kind of fat obsidian plate. So that is how you do custom rendering and basic rendering for mods.